The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with author Shirlee Taylor Haizlip. She's the author of The Sweeter the Juice. I'm Steve Benson. Shirlee, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Shirlee Taylor Haizlip is a graduate of Wellesley College and Harvard University, and she's held a number of prominent positions in public service and the media, including director of the National Center for Film and Video Preservation at the American Film Institute. Well, Shirlee, your story is a wonderful one of family, and of course all families have stories, some of them out in the open, and of course yours is a story of finding people who, in a sense, dropped off the tree.
That's right, and a story of family secrets, family sorrow, and family coming together again. And I'm glad you started off by saying it was a family story, because that's basically the thrust of the story. People get caught up in the issues of race and color, but this was a family story. I wanted to give my mother, for her 80th birthday, the gift of her family, which she had lost and which had lost her when she was a little girl. And the reason they separated from each other, or she was left behind, was that her family of fair-skinned black people decided that they wanted to do what many people did at the time. It was called passing for white, and now we'd probably call it assimilation, complete assimilation. And so she was left behind in the city of Washington, D.C. in the year 1916. And she grew up as a black woman. The rest of her family went to places, some including Minnesota, and lived as white people, married white, didn't tell their mates or spouses they had black heritage, had children and grandchildren who had no knowledge of their black heritage until I came along. So the story is one of looking into the past of the family to understand its present and its future implications.
Secrets, as a sociologist, as you know, can often be damaging.
And debilitating,
and
yes.
debilitating.
Especially carried down from one generation to the other. And in this case, the secrets were hiding part of one's heritage, social history, cultural history, and familial history. And we all know that one cannot be truly whole unless one knows about all parts of oneself. So my new family that I've found has been very interested in knowing about their heritage and very excited about, again, the completing of the family circle.
Has there been any branch of the family that has been troubled?
Not at all. And that perhaps was one of the most startling and surprising things, because it's not great to be black in America. It never has been, and for a long time it may never be. There are many wonderful moments, but it has been very difficult to be black in America. So to tell people who heretofore thought that they were white as a part of the mainstream, that they have black heritage, one would thought might be startling, distracting, negative. But all of the people, and they ranged in age from, say, 14 to 77, all over the country, lived as white all their lives, have been positive, open, met us, publicly declared themselves to be part of this family. And the curious and exploratory thing is, well, what about their psyche? Does a call from me change them overnight when they've lived a certain way all of their lives? There are no longer any racial laws that define them as black by the one-drop rule. Those have all been rescinded since 1987. So I've asked some of my cousins, well, what do you consider yourself now that you have this information? They say, well, I'm white with black heritage, whatever that may mean. But you see, 10 years ago, or up to 1987, they couldn't have said that. Once they found out they were black, legally, they would have been called black, no matter what they looked like or who they married or whatever.
You ask an interesting question in the book. What does race mean if you can choose your own color?
Exactly. If you can choose your own race. You know, we're born with a certain color, and if we want to match ourselves up with other people, genetically we may come out with people like ourselves, but one never knows what color your children are going to be. And of course, sociologists, biologists, geneticists now claim there is no such thing as race. There are certainly cultural differences and ethnic differences and political differences, But we know from genetic studies and DNA studies, it's not theory, that we're all pretty much the same. And
related to Lucy.
Yeah, we're all related to Lucy. And the difference in our genes, I think, is something they say like about a 2% difference. In fact, there's more diversity within the African American grouping than in any other grouping, but we're all pretty much alike.
I'd like to have you read a section from your book for us now.
I'd like to do that. I'm going to read from the prologue. Sometimes I look at people and wonder if they are related to me. I do this in public places and private spaces. There I am in airport terminals and train stations, on ballroom floors and sandy beaches, studying people who might be my relatives. At parties and dances, I have become momentarily distracted by familiar yet unknown faces. I scrutinize the shape of the nose, the cast of the eyes, the curve of the lips, and the jut of the chin. Whenever I see a tall white man with the slightly kinky golden brown hair, subtly flared nostrils, and large ears of my brother, I say, "There's a Morris." I often wonder what those I observe would think if they knew what I was doing. Would they be amused, insulted, nervous? I have indulged in this curious pastime since I was 8 years old, when I first understood that all but one of my mother's family had become white. Most of us are curious as to who we are and why we look the way we do. Many of us know the answer to those questions. Some of us have no idea. This primeval need to know informs my search for my relatives. I liken my curiosity to that of adopted children looking for their kin. I am not entirely sure, if and when the time comes, that I will be comforted to know the sculpture of their cheeks or the architecture of their noses. Mysteries of color have encased my family for 5 generations. Putting together the bits and pieces of my past creates a quilt of melanin patches, shading from dark to light, red to brown, and tan to pink. There are ragged edges and missing segments. I dream I will find some of myself in those holes and gaps. I need to finish the quilt, wearing it smooth until its edges feel soft to my touch, blending its clashing colors to my own notion of harmony. Only then can I store it away in a safe place, taking it out every once in a while to look at it. Genes and chromosomes from Africa, Europe, and a pristine America commingled and created me. I have been called Egyptian, Italian, Jewish, French, Iranian, Armenian, Syrian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Greek. I have also been called black and viola and nigger and high yellow and bright. I am an American anomaly. I am an American ideal. I am the American nightmare. I am the Martin Luther King dream. I am the new America. This is the story of a family that is black, white, and Indian. This is a story of how color separated that family. This is a story of a family that accepted its color but rejected its race. This is a story of a family that accepted its race but rejected its color. This is a story of how the black family prospered and became visible. This is a story of how the white family fled and became invisible. This is the story of the black family's search for the white family from one generation to the next. This is the story of the white family's denial of the black family. This is the story of how the family lived with the choices it made. This is the story of choices still to come. This is all one story. This is the story of my family.
And this is everyone's story.
And I say, it's everyone's story. It happened to so many people. And there are many folks out there who have the same kind of heritage as I do, or some of my cousins who live here in Minnesota or in Colorado or in California or in Idaho. So that there are many people out there who, if they look in the mirror and begin to do some census research, might find that they're not quite who they think they are.
For anyone doing genealogy, there are often watersheds. It might be immigration or any number of things. But for black people who are doing genealogically, often slavery presents that bar.
It does present a bar.
You have a tremendous 2 genealogical charts, maternal and paternal, in the beginning of the book. Tell us about that process.
Well, I advise people to start with the oldest people in the family and the family Bibles, because those are your keepers of records. And then if there was property in the family, look at family deeds. Whether you're black or white, there might have been property in the family. And then go to the census records. Now, for slaves, of course, there were slave censuses. And many people do know where their ancestors came from, say, in the South, and what plantations they were on. And you go to those areas and you do research in local courthouses. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll find deeds of sale. And so there is material. You just have to ferret it out. Not everybody can find it. And there's not material for all slaves, all descendants of slaves. But there is material, but one has to be tenacious and look for it. There was a great deal of oral history in our family, as there is in many African American families. And that's very helpful, and sometimes you start with that. But in terms of my search, there was a lot of history in my family, and my grandfather was an educated man. He'd gone to college in 1896. Very proud black man on my father's side, and he was the keeper of much of the history in his family. So I got a great deal from him and his records. And then I came across a cache of my father's diaries from 1930, I think from 1930 to 1982. And in his diaries, which I thought simply were appointments, were all kinds of wonderful things that validated and confirmed specific childhood memories that I had. My father passed on his love for history to me, which he had gotten from his father. In my mother's case, once I could, we had always known who one of our progenitors, two of our progenitors. One was a federal judge, and the other was his son, who was part black and part white, and he was white. And we didn't know much about him, and I sent to the Virginia archives. And this is a case where a library just totally opened up and changed the source of my information. I sent to the archives and asked them for some material about this man, whom none of us knew anything about, except that he was a judge, and we knew his name. Well, they sent me back volumes of stuff, because not only was he just the judge that I discovered, he was the judge who swore in Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederacy. So he was an important judge.
Wonderful irony, too.
Yeah, an important judge. And so they had a lot of material on him. He was one of the founders of the university there and everything. And in the material was a genealogy of his family, which was the Dandridge family. Well, as a black person, Dandridge had very little meaning to me except for Dorothy Dandridge, the famous black actress of the 50s. If I'd been from Virginia, I would have immediately recognized the name, but I grew up in Connecticut. So I'm looking at this Dandridge family genealogy, wondering why they would send it to me. Discovered that Dandridge was his family name. His mother was a Dandridge. And I looked at her line, and she was the niece of Martha Washington. So it turned out I was related to Martha Washington 8 generations removed. And that was a startling but funny and wonderful discovery, and something that I never would have made if the library had not volunteered the information to me. And it was something I wasn't looking for because I didn't know. Then I also discovered through the same papers that the judge was part Scottish, and that he was a descendant as well of Sir Walter Scott. Now, we'd always known the judge was English, and I guess had we studied the name Halliburton, we would have realized he was from Scotland as well. His father had been a doctor, and there was documentation when he came to America, and then there was further documentation as to where he had come from. I knew that I'd had this Irish great-grandmother, and I knew her name, and I'd always been told that she had come from Tipperary. But in looking back at her old letters and finding certificates, it turned out that her father had been born in a little town, an ancient town called Turles in Ireland. And so I was able to trace her family back to its town of origin. So that was pretty exciting. I was able to trace the Native American line back, which we knew a lot about in my family, back to Roanoke Island, the island of Virginia Dare, where they had the first colony of white Americans. But my family had been there earlier, and I knew a great deal about that family. So that was all tremendously exciting. It took a lot of work, took about 15 years part-time, because I was living a real life as well as doing this research. But one can do it if one is tenacious. And you know, if you're looking at your family tree, you have to be open and not surprised about the color of the berries they're going to find there. And just remember that it's all in the past, you know. Sometimes you're going to find people who were in insane asylums because the census record records that.
And suicides.
Prisons and suicides and scandals. But it's all wonderful and all grist for the mill of, contemporary living.
Again, the ongoing story.
The ongoing story, right.
And also you found documents bringing that past to light, slave documents, for instance.
Yes, very much so. I found some that were related to my great-great-grandfather, the one who was the son of the judge. And he escaped from slavery just before the Civil War ended because they lived in Richmond, Virginia, which was a great point of sale for slaves. And one of the fears that slaves always had was that they would be sold away. And so just before the war ended, he was fair-skinned, and he knew how to play the piccolo, and his father had taught him that, the judge. He lived in the house with the judge. And so he put on a Union Army uniform and marched out with the Union Army band and marched to Richmond, Virginia. But his father helped him once he got to Richmond. His white father helped him get a government job after the war was over. So there was a lot of documentation there. Yeah.
You have a very amusing story that you talk about your husband, whose obviously the last name is Haizlip, and meeting someone on the airplane.
Yes.
Tell us that story.
I had been wanting to find my relatives since I was a little girl, since I knew they existed. And something happened to my husband, which I had hoped would happen to me. We were living in New York at the time, and we were the only Haizlips in the telephone directory, and it's an unusual name. And we had to take a plane to Cleveland, Ohio, I believe it was. And we got to the door of the plane, and that was the time before computerization was in effect, and they still checked you in. And the hostess said, the stewardess said, "I'm sorry, the Haizlips are already on the plane." And my husband said, "That couldn't be, look again." And she looked again, and she saw we were in first class. She said, "Oh, you're right, there's another Haizlip on the plane." And he said to her, "Will you show me where he is once we get into the air?" So he goes back to meet the person, and he comes back to me after 20 minutes with this story. There was an elderly white couple sitting in seats, and their name was Haizlip. So he went up to the man and introduced himself, said, "I've never met a Haizlip who wasn't in my family." And the man was a Southerner, and he was very courtly. His wife was a little cool. And he said, "Well, son, I don't think we could be related." And he said, "Well, where are you from?" And the man said, "Well, from a little town you've never heard of. It's called Blues Creek, North Carolina. It's a tiny little hamlet." And so my husband said, "Well, that's where my father is from, and all of my family was born in Blues Creek." So the man looked at him and said, "Well, must have been Uncle Henry." So my husband said, "What do you mean by Uncle Henry?" He said, "What was Uncle Henry's name?" And the man said, "His name was Henry Cornelius Haizlip, and he liked to get out." And my husband said, "Well, isn't that amazing, because my name is Harold Cornelius Haizlip." So it was clear from this meeting that there was some kind of familial connection, and they exchanged pages from family Bibles, and we did find a common name. But it was an amazing thing to happen out of New York City, meeting all of these people in the country, and we'd never met a white Haizlip before. And it turned out that this white Haizlip was related to this black Haizlip.
Well, on your side of the family, too, you've discovered cousins, people that have lived all their lives as white people, without knowing that they had any black heritage.
That's right. And I think that's an interesting area to explore, because what does that mean for them? Does a call from me change who they are overnight? And they have been quite positive and quite willing. In fact, I have a picture of what I call my Minnesota cousins, because they live right here in Bloomington and in Red Wing, Minnesota. And genotypically and phenotypically, to see these people, one would think that they were white people, which they think of themselves as, and yet they have the same heritage as I do, and I've grown up as a black woman.
There's one picture, one section in your book where you talk about the range of color, and it's a beautiful passage. It's almost like going to Baskin Robbins or Sebastian Joe's
Right.
and reading a range of ice cream.
Yeah, well, one of the things that is sad about the situation in the country in terms of the races, often white people see black people as only one color, but among ourselves, we know that we range in color from molasses to honey and we have wonderful ways to characterize ourselves, to ebony, to blue-black, caramel, peaches and cream, toffee, tea, and usually the characterizations are positive when we speak in terms of ourselves. And many white people have read that passage and commented on it and said, well, you know, I never thought about that, because if I know somebody's black, I just think of that blackness as one color. But because of the amount of mixing in the country, and so many, 85% of black Americans have Native American in them as well, so they may have Native American features or straight hair, or as in they would say in colloquially, good hair, as opposed to hair that's tighter and more curly, which used to be designated as bad hair. We're trying to get, you know, we as African Americans are trying to get away from those designations because they involved sort of a kind of self-hatred, you know, to say one kind of hair was good and the other kind of hair was bad. But those are all things I discuss in my book as related to what I call the pigmentocracy of the country, which I think is a wonderful word, don't you? And it's not just pigmentocracy in terms of black people, but in terms, white people have it too, because for so long in this country, the standard of beauty was the fair, blonde-haired woman, and everybody else was chopped liver. Well, among black people, they sort of replicated that standard, and it was the lighter skin seemed to be the more desirable. And so that created a pigmentocracy, and not more, it created also a colorism in addition to a racism, where people were judged and evaluated according to the color of their skin.
One of my friends said to be sure and ask you about hair, good hair and bad hair, and the incredible processes that both Afro-American men and women went through to, in quotes, to straighten their hair.
Right, and what I think is so amusing is that so many white women now crimp up their hair to try to get the look that black women have had.
Or cornrows.
Or cornrows, yes. And the sadness of all of that is that, again, because of one set of beauty standards, black women wanted to straighten their hair to have it look more what they thought was Caucasian, and went through until recently when they developed straightening creams and ointments and lotions. You know, they had to have their hair pressed and curled and all of that. But women of all races spend a lot of time on their hair, and now it's kind of intermingling. White women are trying to get black hairstyles, and black women continue to wear white hairstyles, or the healthy thing is you see many more natural, what we call natural hairdos on black women.
You write very movingly in the book about your own period of growing up, and also when you were in college and the civil rights movement and the coming of Afro.
Right. I decided in the 60s that I was going to wear an afro, and that many students wore afros, but most adult middle-class black people didn't, because they weren't radicalized. They were, you know, dealing with the status quo. And so I went, and I had a lot of obviously black middle-class friends, and many of them did not wear their hair in afro. But for me, it was a political statement and a cultural statement. And then I moved to the Virgin Islands after a certain period, and it became a necessity because I couldn't keep my hair the way I wanted to. So I just wore a natural afro. And I think I've grown comfortable enough with myself to be able to establish different kinds of hairdos and say, these are a reflection of me, not of my politics.
One of the wonderful stories in your book is about the forgotten aspects, the people who get shunted aside. And as your work with preserving films, you also have been instrumental in helping to save and preserve many of the so-called race films.
Right. That was one of my missions. The National Center for Film and Video Preservation coordinates all of the archival preservation of films in the country, both feature films and documentaries and shorts, which are kept in archives, major archives around the country, including the Library of Congress, the Museum of Modern Art. And when I got to this position, which was as the national director, I saw that black films were not high on the priority list. When I say black films, I mean the race films.
And tell us just a quick snap.
Black films, there was a group of films made in the late 30s and early 40s, and they were called black films. They had all black casts. They were quickie productions, not high budget, and they served a market. They served a black market in southern cities, and they did a big circuit. That was at the time when blacks only played maids or butlers in white films, but in the black films or the race films, they had a whole gamut of positions, and you saw real life professors and businessmen.
Or cowgirl, one of your sisters.
My sister was an actress, and she was a cowgirl.
Yeah.
And I knew that these were as valuable a resource as anything else that reflected American culture. And I thought that they should be given some priority in terms of being saved. And I worked on that and developed a national database of black films for the first time. And having that database is the first step in making sure that the films would be preserved.
The main thing that comes out of your book is a great sense of healing and openness, again, dispelling secrets.
I think so, because I think if we can look into our past and accept what we find there and understand how it links us all, it gives us hope for the future. If we can look at each other as distant cousins, extended family, we're going to be kinder to each other because we're more tolerant of each other. We're more tolerant of family than we are of strangers. And if we think of ourselves as genetically linked in this country, there's no reason why then we shouldn't think of ourselves as extended family.
But still, prejudice does exist. Prejudice, one of the cankers gnawing at the heart of the American psyche.
But you know, prejudice usually exists because of ignorance, and it usually exists because we think people are so different from us. And the point of my book is that we're really much more alike than we know.
What are your next projects now?
Well, I have a follow-up to the book, and that's going to be an exploration of my cousin's psyches, not in a psychological way, but just in a series of discussions in terms of what has happened in their lives, in their, quote, white lives, since this information was revealed to them. And I'm going to intersperse that with excerpts from very passionate, dramatic, thoughtful letters that I've received, and anecdotes about what has happened to me across the country in terms of stories that I've heard. There's a wonderful story called that begins, a lady came up to me and she said, "We were colored once." And I didn't exactly know what she meant. She had red hair and blue eyes and pale skin.
Passing.
And she told me the story of what had happened in her family. I thought that would make a great book title, "We Were Colored Once."
And the sweeter the juice.
The sweeter the juice is an old folklore saying, comes from the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice.
When do you expect your next book to be out?
I hope within a year. And then I'm going to do a book about a president, a white president, who finds out that he has black heritage. And that's going to be a novel. And what does he do with that information? I think that's going to be a lot of fun.
Shirlee, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Shirlee Taylor Haizlip is the author of The Sweeter the Juice. It's published by Touchstone Books. I'm Steve Benson.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.